Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 674 for December 31st, 2017. As we wind up one year and begin a new one, here's hoping 2018 is a happy and healthy one for you. Coming up in a few minutes.
It's not a museum in that it's put in here and nobody looks at it and everyone's afraid to touch it. It's a living resource for the company, and that's something I'm really keen to share, is that your archive can be a resource. It's information.
The Irish Whiskey Archive at Midleton Distillery is home to more than 200 years' worth of whiskey history. Carol Quinn is the archivist for Irish Distillers, and she'll take us into a room that few people are ever allowed to enter. The room that houses the distillery's liquid library. That's coming up later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. I'll also have the calendar of events, this week's Your Voice, and a few of my final drams of the year in the What I'm Tasting This Week department. That's all coming up on this week's WhiskyCast.
The holidays are a time to celebrate, to share something special with friends and family. This year, why not consider sharing something truly special? An engraved bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label. Support for WhiskyCast comes from Johnnie Walker. Visit johnniewalker.com to find out more about engraving options near you.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Let's get started with the week's news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. When distilleries in the U.S. resume production this week after the holidays, they'll be benefiting from the new tax reform legislation passed by Congress just before Christmas. As we reported last week, distillers have been praising the cut in federal alcohol excise taxes that was part of the legislation. Distillers will now pay just $2.70 per proof gallon on their first 100,000 gallons of spirit that come out of bond for sale, with the old rate of $13.50 per proof gallon for anything above that level. It's a move that's expected to boost the craft distilling sector, since most small-scale distillers don't even come close to that annual threshold. There are also tax cuts for brewers and winemakers as well. However, there's already a backlash from public health advocates. Politico reports groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving are worried that the tax cut will lead to increases in drunk driving, underage drinking, and other problems. The critics say research shows links between lower tax rates and increased alcohol consumption, and they believe taxes ought to be increased instead of being cut. That's assuming that the tax cuts are passed along to consumers in the form of lower prices. And it's an assumption that Mark Gorman of the Distilled Spirits Council disagrees with.
Every distiller we've talked to, every distiller who's a member of ours, insists that those savings will go back into new equipment and new people to help make more of whatever it is they make.
Since the excise tax cut is only good for 2 years before Congress has to extend it, there will be a chance to look at any actual health-related side effects from the tax cut before an extension vote. Of course, it's been a pretty quiet week between Christmas and New Year's, but this time of the year also usually brings a bit of news from Buckingham Palace in London. The Queen's New Year's honors list was released Friday, and there are a couple of honorees to note in the whiskey world. Nigel Mills, the co-founder and chairman of the Lakes Distillery in Cumbria, was named a Commander of the Order of the British Empire for services to entrepreneurship in the Northeast and Cumbria. Beefeater Gin Master Distiller Desmond Payne was named a member of the Order of the British Empire for his service to the British gin industry. A bit of a tangent? Not really. Early in his career, he worked at the long-gone Kinclaith Distillery in Scotland, along with the Strathclyde Grain Whisky Distillery, so there's a place to mention his honor here on WhiskyCast. So, what's the oldest bourbon that you've ever tried? For me, it's about 24 years old, and they don't get much older than that until now. Would you believe a 45-year-old bourbon? On March 1st, Louisville's Fraser History Museum will be pouring what's probably the oldest bourbon ever bottled. The Final Reserve James Thompson and Brother bourbon comes from the original Glenmore Distillery in Owensboro, Kentucky. 86-year-old Buddy Thompson ran Glenmore until it was sold to Guinness in 1991, but the sale did not include a few barrels of bourbon that Buddy Thompson had set aside for his own use.
In about 1970, we had produced some bourbon, which we considered to be our finest bourbon, oldest recipe and all. And we set aside a few barrels thinking someday we'd like to do a commemorative bottling, maybe at the millennium or some particular anniversary. We weren't sure what, but just thought it would be nice to have some available. And that became this product, which after 45 years, we decided was old enough and ready to bottle. And that's what it is. It's got a beautiful color to it and a very rich aroma. And, of course, a strong flavor, a lot of tannin in it, like an old cognac. We're bottling it up in a decanter with a gift box, and they each contain a 750 milliliter decanter, a 100 milliliter bottle of tasting, so you can have a taste of the product without having to open the decanter right away. I think people don't want to save those probably. A piece of a barrel, a snifter for tasting purposes, and a brochure that describes the whole process and tells a little bit of the history of the company.
Where did this barrel sit for 45 years?
Well, it was in several different warehouses. And of course, it was at Glenmore for the first 20-odd years because, and then when Glenmore was acquired, it was by that time it became a Guinness warehouse, but it stayed there for another 10 years or so. And then I moved, I would have been at its age about 30, and then I moved it at that point to Bardstown, Kentucky, which is where there's a little distillery and a contract bottling company, which is where we did the bottling, started the bottling process. So it's been under, government warehouse all this time.
Why didn't you open it up before then? Or go ahead and pour it out before then? Because 45 years, one would think that this thing is going to taste a lot like licking a barrel stave almost.
Well, that's interesting. But I've had probably 20 people now have tasted it. And about a third of them prefer it just the way it is. They like the strong tannin flavor, the bite of the tannin, I call it, because it really is pretty strong to my palate. But I remembered, and somebody reminded me of it, I remember years ago, 60 years or so ago, being told that when you're dealing with very old cognac or bourbon, or probably scotch too, that if the tannins are overpowering, a couple of drops of sherry in the snifter will smooth that out significantly. And we tried that, and sure enough, it worked. So we've put a little card in each of these gift boxes that says, try it the way it is. It's right out of the barrel at 120 proof. And once you've done that, then if you find that taste is too strong, put a little sherry in it. It doesn't take much, and a few drops, and it really does a wonder to the tannins.
Now, I understand there's a second barrel that's going to be released in June. Is that correct?
There will be a second bottling We set aside some 1970 whiskey, some 71, and some 73. So we've got the three. They're all three are out of the barrels now and in tanks, so they've stopped aging. But there'll be the three ages will be bottled. This first was 45, the second 44, and then 42, I guess it would be.
The Fraser History Museum is helping to coordinate the sale of around 250 decanters of that 45-year-old Final Reserve bourbon at the March 1st event, along with the help of the team from Washington's Jack Rose Dining Saloon. The price has not yet been announced, but all of the proceeds will go to veterans groups and the Fraser Museum. And as for those two younger batches that Mr. Thompson mentioned, at least one of them will be released this June during the Kentucky Bourbon Affair in Louisville. There's a link for more information in the show notes for this week's episode at whiskycast.com. That's also where you can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long. The news is brought to you by Highland Park. Look for the latest Highland Park single malt, full volume, distilled back in 1999 and bottled in 2017, with all of the flavor you'd expect out of a vintage Highland Park, and then some. Find out more at highlandparkwhiskey.com.
7 swans a-swimming, 6 geese a-laying, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. All seems a little excessive, doesn't it? When there's one bird they really want this Christmas. Redbreast. The warm glow of ripe fruit, honeyed figs, and crackling cinnamon. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast, and the perfect gift to slip under the tree.
Let's open up the inbox now for this week's Your Voice, brought to you by Lot 40. Thanks to everyone who sent along holiday greetings over the last few days for Christmas and New Year's. I hope you've all been able to relax with family, friends, and a few good drams. Let's get an update first on one of the tweets I read last time around from Ryan Campbell, who decided that since his girlfriend's father claims to like peaty whiskies, he'd take some Ardbeg Corey Vrecken over for Christmas Eve. Heard from Ryan this week. Here's what he had to say. I survived unleashing Corey Vrecken. It took a lot of ice cubes, unfortunately, though. I lived to taste these beauties on Christmas with my dad and brother. And Ryan posted a photo of Elijah Craig Barrel Proof, that boutique whiskey company's 42-year-old Invergordon single grain, and the Glendronach Allerdy's single malt. Now, if you've been following WhiskyCast on Twitter, you've probably seen this week what I've been calling the 12K giveaway. We were about 300 or so followers away from 12,000 in mid-December, so I decided to offer up a few WhiskyCast Glencairn glasses if we made it to 12,000 by midnight New Year's Eve. We made it with several days to spare, and I've been picking 3 winners a day for the final 4 days of 2017. It turns out some of you really want one of these glasses. Some examples. From Snagsy 1980, pick me! ! From Violent Bob in Dublin, Mark, right here. From Whiskey Daddy at Jotterface, come on, my shelves might take the weight of one more Glencairn glass before they crash to the ground. Now, that's a challenge. So Jotterface is one of our winners, along with Ryan Campbell. A number of people who did not win asked whether it's possible to buy a WhiskyCast Glencairn glass. The only time that we've ever offered them for sale was back in 2010, when we had some special 5th anniversary glasses made up to raise money for Charity Water. Other than that, they've never been available for sale. The only way to get one is by being a panelist on the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel, or being one of our Whiskey Club of the Month winners on that show, occasional contests like this one, or if you're lucky enough to find me at a whiskey festival, and I have one in my gear bag. But if that ever changes, I'll let you know. Several of you passed along compliments to end the year as well. From John Robertson at JRR1234, thank you for the great podcasts in 2017. Looking forward to what 2018 brings, especially regarding bourbon developments. Thank you, John. I'm looking forward to it too. Matt Covington at Out of Doors on Twitter said this: great podcast with tons of information, but I have one complaint. I have a hard time staying at work because I get thirsty. Sorry about that, Matt. Once again, thanks to every single one of you for following us on social media or just being part of the WhiskyCast community. There's much more ahead in the works for 2018, and I hope you'll join us every week. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always post it on the Your Voice page at whiskycast.com. Want to hear your comments on the show? Well, just record a voice memo on your smartphone and email it to us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Of course, we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast too. This week's Your Voice is brought to you by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. If you're already looking ahead to vacation time in 2018, let's run down some of the major whiskey festivals around the world this coming year so you can try and make those travel plans early. Whiskey Live New York is coming up February 28th. Dramfest 2018 is March 2nd through the 4th in Christchurch, New Zealand. Whiskey Fest Chicago is coming up March 23rd, along with Whiskey Live in London on the 23rd and 24th. The Nth Ultimate Whiskey Experience is April 4th through the 7th in Las Vegas. The Spirit of Speyside Whiskey Festival runs from May 3rd through the 7th. The Isla Festival of Malt and Music, Fay Gilles, is May 25th through June 2nd. The Kentucky Bourbon Affair is June 5th through the 10th, and that includes Whiskey Live in Louisville. Maltstock is September 7th through the 9th in Nijmegen, the Netherlands. The Kentucky Bourbon Festival is in Bardstown, September 10th through the 16th. And the Whiskey Show in London is the weekend of September 28th through the 30th. Finally, Whiskey Fest New York is set for December 4th. Right now, we have 158 different events throughout 2018 on the searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. If you have a festival or a tasting coming up, just use the contact form on our website and let us know about it.
You don't need a special occasion to open a bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label. But when you have a special occasion, why not celebrate with a specially engraved bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label? Here's how one whiskey lover celebrated his team's recent success. He arranged to have 108 specially engraved bottles of Johnnie Walker Blue Label made for his co-workers. You might say he hit a home run. Just like a perfectly executed double play, Johnnie Walker Blue Label is smooth and well-rounded, and unlike a trophy, never needs polishing. Support for WhiskyCast comes from Johnnie Walker. Visit johnniewalker.com to find out more about engraving options near you.
Johnnie Walker Blue Label Blended Scotch Whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. Carol Quinn's office at Middleton Distillery in Ireland is sort of like a time machine. She's the archivist for Irish Distillers, and the Irish Whiskey Archive has documents dating back more than 200 years. Imagine being able to pull out John Jameson Jr.'s journal from 1826, or the records from the very first days of some of Ireland's major distilleries. I'm not talking about copies or scanned versions, but the real thing. Better yet, imagine a room full of whiskey bottles, not quite 2 centuries old, but filled with some of Ireland's legendary whiskies. You don't have to imagine. I was at Middleton recently, and Carol Quinn opened up the doors for a rare peek inside the Irish Whiskey Archive.
So we're just going down the corridor to what's known as the Liquid Library. on in.
And this is a whiskey lover's dream.
Very few people come in here, Mark, now, so it's a pleasure to have you and to have your viewers. And what we try and do here is we keep a copy of everything produced by Irish Distillers and the companies that combine together to form Irish Distillers.
The steel shelves are full of bottles. One bottom shelf has some larger ceramic jugs with some of the legendary names in Irish whiskey history: Powers, Redbreast, Middleton, and of course, Jameson. Many of the bottles are empty, but a few are full, and one would be tempted to sneak out a flask full of vintage whiskey. But that would be wrong. Those samples are used by Middleton's whiskey makers for lab analysis to compare against the distillery's current whiskies and as a resource to fight counterfeiting, while the bottles and labels are a resource for the Irish Distillers marketing team, showing where their brands came from as a guide to the path ahead.
These all date from a time when Jameson preferred to sell its whiskey in bulk by the barrel to the publicans or the bonders, who would then bottle it themselves, and the distillery would supply the labels. But the problem is that you'd have somebody going into the bar and they're faced with all of this. And what is the drink they like? Which is their favourite? It's pretty much all the same whiskey, but it was confusing. So in 1963, Jameson decided for once and for all to bottle in-house in Bow Street. And what they did is they produced what was called Jameson 10. And it's gone through a number of reiterations, and it was relaunched last year as Crested. From Jameson 10, it became known as Crested 10, and it's now known as Crested. And it was the very first whiskey bottled in-house by Jameson. And you can see in the latest bottling, it's harked back to the earlier days when Jameson was in fact in a clear bottle. So the designers would have begun their journey in designing the new packaging for Crested by looking back at our history and working forward then from that.
And then you keep, obviously, all the special commemorative bottlings, the St. Patrick's Day Jameson bottles, a little of everything in here, right? Absolutely.
And again, it's not a museum in that it's put in here and nobody looks at it and everyone's afraid to touch it. It's a living resource for the company. And that's something I'm really keen to share, is that your archive can be a resource. It's information and it's how you manage the information. And for Irish Distillers, it's been a great journey in exploring our history, learning about our history and sharing our history.
The only time something leaves the archive is when a brand is sold. For instance, when Sazerac bought the Paddy Irish whiskey brand from Irish Distillers back in 2016, the archive's collection of Paddy bottles and history went with it, even though the whiskey itself is still being made at Middleton.
Now, these are Redbreast bottles that I don't think anybody has seen in years.
Well, there's one or two very diligent collectors in Ireland who have fabulous collections.
You won't find old Jameson ad signs, barware, or other things that some whiskey lovers collect. One, there just wouldn't be enough room. And two, that's not the purpose.
The function of the archive here is information. And whether that information is written down in the form of a book or a ledger, or whether it's information on a label, that's what's important. And we don't duplicate that information. So if I already have it in terms of the graphics on the label, I don't need it in terms of graphics on point of sale. So I don't actually actively collect. I certainly don't buy. I don't buy anything. I'm not in the market for buying because I don't want to create a market. I don't want to create inflated prices. If there are collectors out there, they can rest assured they're not bidding against me in any auction because I'm not bidding.
I could see where somebody would be worried about that.
Yeah, but it doesn't happen, so they can beat themselves up.
I've seen some of these green spot bottles at Mitchell in Dublin, but that's one of the few places you'd find them.
Yeah, they're quite rare. And what you have behind you, which I think would be of interest, is a timeline of the development of Jameson 12-year-old. From the 1930s, in this very distinctive hexagonal bottle, up into the 1950s, the 1970s, onwards, when it morphed into the 12-year-old Distillery Reserve in all its different iterations, coming down to when it became Jameson 1780, also a 12-year-old, and morphing now into the bottle, which has recently stopped production.
But there's still room on the shelf there for one more if you needed it, right?
I could squeeze another in at any time.
This one room devoted to bottle storage is about 20 feet by 30 feet, built to museum-quality archival standards. Not quite a vault, but close.
In this strong room, there's no exterior light, there's no outdoor sunlight allowed in. The lighting on the ceiling here has UV filters, so it's not going to fade the labels. When we came in, we turned on the light. Normally everything sits here in darkness. I almost call it suspended animation, really. So it's all about preserving. And that's why we don't normally bring visitors in here, because even you and I standing here now, we're actually raising the humidity with our own breath. So it's not something that ever could be a visitor attraction. It's an archive. It is somewhere that something is preserved.
Well, let's get out of here before we raise the humidity too much.
There are 4 more rooms just like the Liquid Library in the archive, with a treasure trove of history that goes back more than 2 centuries. Carol Quinn has been cataloging that material in her first-floor office for the last 5 years and has a long way to go.
When the 3 historic distilleries that had formed Irish Distillers back in 1966, you had John Jameson and Son in Dublin, John Power and Son in Dublin, and the Cork Distilleries Company here in Cork, which ran Middleton. And those 3 companies merged in 1966. And in 1975, production was brought down here to a new site in Middleton. And the old distilleries in Dublin were closed. But because they had both been in existence since the 18th century, all the historic records were still in situ. Now, at the time, the company didn't have any resources. Funds were really tight, but they knew this was important. So what they did is they actually boxed up all that material, which was 40 pallets worth of material, and they gave it for storage into the National Archives in Dublin to keep it safe until such a time would come that the company would have the resources to put into building a proper archive. And that time came 5 years ago. So the 40 pallets of material from Powers and from Jameson were released back to us. And for the last 5 years, I've been going through them pallet by pallet and discovering something new every day.
How important was it to maintain all of this for future generations?
Hugely important. I can't really emphasize what a far-reaching decision it was when they were closing those distilleries not to throw away the paper record. It would have been so easy to. And Ireland is littered with bonfires of records that people move premises and you go into a more modern, more streamlined environment and you don't have the excess space. We're sitting here at Old Middleton and you can see around warehouses, you can see old grain stores. That's where the records of Middleton were kept, simply because there was space for them. So recorded there are the histories of individuals, people whose lives aren't recorded in any other medium. There's no birth cert for them, there's no death cert for them. The only record we have of them living and dying is in the wage books from the distilleries. So from the human point of view, it was hugely important that they kept those records. From the point of view of the history of Irish whiskey, it's an unparalleled resource. You have here in the archive at IDL the entire history of the Irish whiskey industry and the periods of growth, the periods of decline, the periods of consolidation. It's all here. The story is all here. And it's due to the foresight of those men in 1966 that it wasn't thrown out.
Right now, the archive is not available to outside researchers, but Carol Quinn hopes that will happen once the entire collection has been cataloged, and at some point in the future, part of the archive's historical records might be available online. As for those wage books, possibly the only records that still exist for many distillery workers, Carol Quinn gets inquiries from their descendants, and she tries to find as much information as possible about them to share with the families. Now, if you'd like to see what the Liquid Library looks like, along with the rest of the archive, watch the latest episode of WhiskyCast HD. It's available on YouTube, iTunes, and, of course, at whiskycast.com. Full disclosure, my visit to the archive came during a press trip to the distillery as a guest of Irish Distillers, but as with all of our content, full editorial control remains with WhiskyCast. And that's this week's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin. Speaking of history, Lagavulin's whiskey makers went back into their history to recreate the Lagavulin 8-year-old Islay single malt for the distillery's 200th anniversary a while back. Alfred Barnard raved about tasting an 8-year-old Lagavulin when he visited the distillery 130 years ago. And today's whiskey lovers raved about the modern-day version so much that it's now becoming a permanent part of the Lagavulin lineup. Look for it at your local whiskey shop or find out more at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Let's start off with the Tomatin Cask Strength Single Malt. It's bottled at 57.5% ABV and matured in a combination of ex-Oloroso sherry and first fill ex-bourbon barrels. The nose is fruity with notes of peaches, red apples, vanilla, mango, and a hint of sandalwood. The taste is fruity and vibrant with peaches, orange peel, red apples, mango, vanilla, hints of white pepper and ginger with a great balance and mouthfeel. The finish is medium length and slightly dry with lingering spices and fruity notes. I like this one. I'm scoring the Tomatin Cask Strength a 93. Let's compare it with the 1995 Tomatin, which was matured for 18 years in refill casks before being transferred into Oloroso sherry hogsheads. It's bottled at 46% ABV, and the nose has notes of dried apricots and banana chips, Christmas cake, and just a touch of toffee. The taste has a good oakiness. It's dry with plums, raisins, ginger, and hints of allspice and cocoa beans. The finish is dry with muted spices, dried fruits, and a good oakiness. I'm scoring the Tomatin 1995 a 92. More tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, makers of Whiskey Advocate's 2017 Whiskey of the Year, Elijah Craig Barrel Proof. The 12-year-old barrel proof bourbon was pitted blind against competition from around the globe and was consistently ranked number 1 by the magazine's testers. Meet the whole Elijah Craig family at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely. Drink wisely. Now, let's look at the Glenmorangie Grand Vintage Malt 1990. This one was the debut release in Glenmorangie's Bond House No. 1 collection. It's bottled at 43% ABV. The nose is fruity and floral with orange peel, dried flowers, honey, and muted spices. The taste starts off fruity with orange peel, banana, honey, and a hint of ginger, followed by a touch of allspice that comes in and lasts through the finish, which is nice and long with a good balance of fruits and soft spices. I'm scoring the Glenmorangie Grand Vintage Malt 1990 a 93. And finally, let's wind up the year with a 1992 Bruichladdich single cask, bottled by Specialty Drinks for its Single Malts of Scotland range. This one comes from shortly before Bruichladdich closed for a few years, and it was matured in a hogshead cask before being bottled at 55.4% ABV. The nose has a soft peatiness with touches of driftwood, heather, vanilla, and a hint of honey. The taste is thick and peppery with a subtle peatiness and notes of driftwood smoke, heather, vanilla, ginger, honey, and a touch of dark chocolate. The finish is long and smooth with a nice peppery bite and a gentle smokiness. I'm scoring the Single Malts of Scotland Bruichladdich 1992 single cask a 91. I'm adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of more than 2,000 tasting notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find links for WhiskyCast HD and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast, presented by the Whiskey Exchange. You'll also find the latest whiskey news, events, and much, much more, including a complete archive of past episodes. Please take a minute this week and leave a review or rating for WhiskyCast on iTunes or your favorite podcast site. Those ratings do figure into the search results that can help other whiskey lovers discover the show when they're looking for podcasts online. Let's keep the cask strength conversation going all week long. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast, and my email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
You don't need a special occasion to celebrate with something truly unique, but a personally engraved bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label can make any occasion special. Support for WhiskyCast comes from Johnnie Walker. Visit johnniewalker.com to find out more about engraving options near you.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2017, and comes to you each week from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening, and have a great 2018.